1945 was a watershed year in the history of the world, because in 1945 the concept of the Nazism and concept of fascism came to an halt, and it gives birth to the two more ideologies. One was communism or socialism, and the another one was capitalism. The capitalistic ideology country were led by the United States, and the countries those who were following the socialism or communist ideology were led by the Soviet Union. After the end of the Second World War, the world was divided into two parts. One block, capitalistic block, and the another block, communist block. There was another block. The third block was led by India, Indonesia, Yugoslavia, and Egypt. And the name of that block was non-aligned block, because the countries, those who were in that block, decided not to join any of these two blocks, either the block that was led by the United States or the block led by the Soviet Union, because these two blocks engaged into a shadow war. That war we know in today's time is Cold War. And today we will going to talk about what was the Cold War. And the second question we will going to discuss that are we living in the same days? Because the recent events are indicating that we are living in the same era. Now, before getting into the second questions, we need to understand what was the Cold War, how it began, and how it came to an end. The Cold War after the 1945 began as a result of the arms race and the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And also the geopolitical race was there. If we are considering the geopolitical race, then the Soviet Union was included other countries that was captured by the Soviet Union after the end of the Second World War. So the countries, those who were under the influence of the Soviet Union, were the Central Asian countries, the regions or the countries in the Caucasus regions, and some countries in the Eastern Europe. That includes Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Eastern Germany, not Western Germany. Western Germany was under the influence of the United States. Czechoslovakia, USSR influenced. Hungary was influenced by the USSR, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. And Yugoslavia was the communist states, and that was the another block. That was the part of the non-aligned block. So between these two blocks, the several events started happening. First, the civil war in Greek. What happened to the Greek? After the end of the Second World War, the civil war broke out between the two groups of Greek. One group was led by the Kingdom of Greece, that was the established government of Greece, and the another group, the opposition group, was led by the Provincial Democratic Government of Greece, which was governed by the Communist Party of Greece. The acronym is KKE, and its military branch, the Democratic Army of Greece. Acronym is DSE. And the rebels supported by Albania and Yugoslavia, with the support of the United Kingdom and the United States, the Greek government, the government of Greece, the Kingdom of Greece, win over the communist influenced group. So that was the first event that happened. And after that, several other events happened. In the Middle East, the Israel came to an existence. With the existence of Israel, something had happened. Something bad had happened in the Central Asia. The Central Asian countries started fighting with each other. Not fighting with each other. They started fighting against Israel, because according to the logic of the Central or Western Asian countries, Israel does not exist. It is Palestine, and the Palestine has the right to take care of that landmass. But Israel was created with 1948 United Nations mandate, and as a result of the creation of Israel, several events started happening in Central Asia. One of the events was Suez Canal crisis. The Suez Canal crisis was that there was the crisis between Egypt, with the help of the Soviet Union, and the Israel with the help of United Kingdom and France. Israel wanted to capture the Suez Canal because Egypt was blocking Israel passage through Suez Canal. And at that time, Israel, United Kingdom and the France were handling the Suez Canal. But the Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and took over the Suez Canal. As a result of that, United Kingdom started feeling that their power was reducing. As their power was reducing, they took help from France and tried to capture Suez Canal. That created a war in the Middle East. But it did not last long. There was a negotiation. After the negotiation, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt and Suez Canal was freed from Israel. And Israel happily let it go. Not only Israel, there was a problem in Hungary. The Hungary Revolution happened. There was a problem in Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, because the Poland had its knack of being independent state after the end of the Second World War. But Poland was captured by the Soviet Union, and Poland decided to fight internally against the Soviet troops during the time of the Cold War. And the Eastern Germany was under the influence of the Soviet Union, and the Berlin, the capital of Germany, was divided into two states, means two parts. One part was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the another part was controlled by United States and the United Kingdom. So there was a problem after the end of the Second World War. Soviet Union started blocking the flow of goods into Berlin. As a result of that, United States has to send the goods with the help of the aircrafts. That was called the Berlin blockade. And after that, 1947. In 1947, United Kingdom started losing in colonial power. India got independence. And the colonies of the United Kingdom started getting independence. Not only the United Kingdom, the colonies, those who were under the French, Dutch and the Portuguese, they were all started getting independence from their colonial countries. That is why those countries started losing their power, and they started making the block with the United States because they needed a bigger ally. So they all ganged up with the United States, tried to influence the Soviet Union, because according to their logic, Soviet Union was influencing those countries to fight against the colonial masters. And that was actually happening in Africa, not in the case of most of the Asian countries, but something happened in Vietnam. The Vietnam was divided into two parts. When the French were ruling Vietnam, then in 1954 the French has to leave Vietnam because Vietnam wanted independence, and French was very reluctant to give them independence. As a result of that, the fight broke out between France and the North Vietnamese rebels, and France lost the war. And then United States started taking interest, and they started sending the troops to the southern Vietnam. They started helping the dictatorial government, those who were ruling at that time, the southern Vietnam. And in 1964, there was a event happened. That was the Gulf of Tonkin. In the Gulf of Tonkin, according to the United States, that the northern Vietnamese soldiers or the northern Vietnamese rebels attacked one of the US ships, and they tried to drown that ship. As a result of that, United States passed one of the resolution in its Senate and in its Congress that gives the United States government to send the troops without taking cognizance of House or Senate. So that was the beginning of the new war in the northeastern countries. That was Vietnam. And the United States engaged with Vietnam, and they fought the war from 1954 to 1975 until they left Vietnam. So that was the war in Vietnam. After that, Suez crisis I have already discussed. Then there was an Algerian crisis. Algerian crisis was one of the crises that was because of the French ruling. French was so reluctant to let go of their colonial countries, because French has decided to influence those countries to make their economy bigger, and they still influencing the countries in the Sahel region. Sahel regions means Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso. These are the countries were under the influence of France, and France still influence those countries with the help of the currency that these countries are still using. So there was that. Now, Algerian crisis, then so many things happened. There was a Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. There was an Afghan invasion by the Soviet Union in 1979. There was Chernobyl incident in 1986. In Chernobyl, there was a nuclear power plant, and though that nuclear power plant got burst and his dome was destroyed, that was one of the most water-shedding event in the history of the world, because that power plant was a civilian power plant. That was the fault of the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union made a grave mistake in handling the nuclear power. So many things happened during the time of the Cold War. 1979, the exchange rate mechanisms, the United States economy get into recession because of the Vietnam War. Several things happened. And the nuclear race. We cannot forget about the nuclear race, that what had happened. And we cannot forget about how United States helped the Western European countries to build their economy, to build their infrastructure. Because after the end of the Second World War, United States came up with two plans. One was the plan to dominate the Western European countries or Western European region militarily. That is why they formed NATO. NATO is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And to give help, economical help to the Western European countries, they came up with the plan called the Marshall Plan. United States also offered Marshall Plan to the Soviet Union, but Soviet Union refused. It is a common thing that Soviet Union will never going to take the help from the United States, because Soviet Union needed the bigger enemy. United States also needed the bigger enemy. So each of them needed a bigger enemy to run their economy, to run their military industrial complex, and to run their enmity. And there was another plan, that was the Marshall Plan. I have already talked about, to counter the United States. Soviet Union also came up with the military alliance that was called the Warsaw Pact and the Molotov Plan. Molotov Plan was the counter of the Marshall Plan. And we should not forget about the China. China was not under the influence of the United States, but it was its government, the KMT. The right-wing KMT government was under the influence of the United States, not the communist government. That is why there was a civil war between communist and KMT, the right-wing government. At last, the communists won against the KMT, and the KMT had to take exile in today's time we called in Taiwan. The Taiwan where the KMT groups are ruling right now, and communist China, that is the mainland China. And the situation in today's time is that any time or at any moment of the time, the war can be happen between these two nations. And this war can push the world into a third world war situation. So when China came under the influence of the communist, then Mao Zedong became the premier of China, and they started pushing the communist ideology in its neighbor. That tends the United States, because United States never wanted a communist ideology in their communist ideological country. in the backyard of their ally. At that time, the ally was the Philippines. Philippines was the ally of the United States. And United States also has the ally in Southeast Asian nations, among the Southeast Asian nations. So they never wanted communist ideology in their own country. They never wanted communist ideology in Europe or any of its neighbor. So as a result of that, they ran a very, very secret operation that was called the MK Ultra. MK Ultra was an illegal operation run by the CIA, funded by the CIA's scientific group, that was there to change the human mind by using medicine, by using the propaganda, by using torture, by using several other things. To conduct that operation, United States government used LSD. LSD is a drugs which is banned all over the world, that was used against the subjects. Subjects means the human beings, those who were the part of the operations. There were several institutes, colleges, hospitals included within that operation, that MK Ultra operation, but it was so secluded, so hidden that nobody knows they were the part of that operations. Now we need to talk about the nuclear race, because nuclear race was very important. The nuclear race began because of the United States. We can clearly or squarely put the blame on the United States, but there was some catch, because not only the United States were working on the nuclear program during the time of the Second World War, Soviet Union was also working on the nuclear plan during the time of the Cold War. But the United States came up with first. United States conducted its first nuclear test on July 16, 1945 in Los Alamos. That is a place in New Mexico. And that plan was run by the J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory during the Manhattan Project. What is the Manhattan Project? The Manhattan Project was the project under which the United States came up with the nuclear bomb, and they tested that nuclear bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the time of Second World War. And the Manhattan Project, also called the Los Alamos, where the nuclear bomb were tested, that place called the Trinity. Trinity was the name given by the Oppenheimer. And after the nuclear weapon used by the United States against Japan, Hiroshima and the Nagasaki, the USSR or the Soviet Union speed up their nuclear operation or the nuclear bomb making operations. They started gathering the nuclear fuels from Xinjiang. Xinjiang was at that time was an independent region, was not part of China, that was independently ruled by some of the leaders of that time. But when the Soviet Union came to power, when the leaders of that time, Soviet Union, the Stalin came up with an idea and forced China to capture Xinjiang. So you can clearly understand that Xinjiang was not part of China, but Stalin forced China to take care of that region because Soviet Union had their interest at that time, which was nuclear fuel or uranium, you can say, or plutonium, you can say. Xinjiang has huge amounts of nuclear fuel, and they were using that nuclear fuel to make their bomb, to make their first nuclear bomb, which was Jo-1. And they tested their first nuclear bomb on August 29, 1949 at Semipalatinsk. Semipalatinsk was the site in the Kazakhstan, today's Kazakhstan. At that time, it was part of the Soviet Union. And as a result of this test, India today's time do not have some parts of the Kashmir. Some parts of the Kashmir, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, is not part of India in today's time because of this test. Because at that time, United Kingdom was also looking for the nuclear bomb material, and because the nuclear deterrence was important against Russia. Russia was one of the enemy of the United Kingdom. As a result of that, they placed 3 listening sites, acoustic sites. I mean, the site which will going to record the sounds of the nuclear bomb, and the collection sites. Collections means when the nuclear bomb gets blasted, then something happened, then it creates some materials, so that material subsidized, and that was being captured by the United Kingdom with the help of their some receiving planes they were using at that time. So those planes were then stationed in Pakistan at that time. As a result of that, United Kingdom used their force and the mind, used their influence to separate that region from India. And Aksai Chin, why the Aksai Chin was not, in today's time, is not part of India? Because of the Soviet Union. Stalin forced China to capture the Aksai Chin region, because Aksai Chin regions have huge amounts of uranium and plutonium. And Soviet Union at that time needed uranium and plutonium. As a result of that, Stalin forced China to capture that region to provide Soviet Union more amount of uranium and plutonium. And China did that because China was getting weapons, support of their weapons from the Soviet Union at that time. China knew that United States was the enemy state, as if they were the communist. The communist cannot go with a state which were following the capitalism at that time. They needed weapon to counter the United States, and to counter the United States they needed help of the Soviet Union. That is why they were in the basket of the Soviet Union and that at that time. But we will going to give up with an examples of the series of events that force China to get apart, to ally with the United States in 1972. We will going to talk about that later. Now, the nuclear deterrence. In 1960s, we can say in the 1960s, in the United States, a master plan for carrying a nuclear war was the first drafted in 1960 at the end of the President Dwight Eisenhower terms. Because the arms race began when the US realized that it was impossible to aim at every Soviet weapon without unleashing an expensive new round of arms race. United States began to understand that Soviet Union was producing the huge amounts of nuclear arsenal. So to counter the arsenal of the Soviet Union, United States started building their own weapons, own nuclear weapons. And they started working in the theory or in the plan called the mutual to the assured destructions. Because United States wanted to launch same number of weapon, the same number of weapon as if the Soviet Union would have launched the same number of that much number of weapons. So that was the plan of the United States to counter the Soviet Union. That is why they started building the 1000 Minuteman missile, 41 Polaris submarine and 500 strategic bomber. These two countries started producing bombers since the Cold War days. United States has B-29, then after that B-36, B-57, then B series. There were all the B series bombers were there. And the United States and the Soviet Union had the TU series bombers the Soviet Union started producing. But when United States realized that the mutual to the assured destruction it's will not going to contain the Soviet Union, then they came with a new concept that gives birth to the mutual assured destructions. That is called the MAT policy. So for the many Americans, the idea of the equal vulnerability and the mutual deterrence came to define the Cold War. Every American and every Soviet citizen started feeling that if nuclear war happened between these two nations, then none of us will going to survive. So mutual deterrence is the best deterrence at that time. And the superpower often wrongly judge each other's intentions and the actions. As we know that in 1962, when we will going to discuss the Cuban Missile Crisis, then we will going to feel that how misguided they were, how they mistrusted each other. In 1959 or 60 or 61, United States started installing their nuclear warheads in Turkey and Italy to counter the US installments of nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy. Soviet Union came up with the plan to plant their missile in Cuba. When Soviet Union started building the silos, United States warning the Soviet Union that they should not come up with the nuclear warheads within the vicinity of the United States. But Soviet Union was so adamant, they started arguing with the United States that if they can come with their nuclear arsenals in their doorsteps, then they have the right to install the nuclear arsenal in their doorstep. That was a tense moment for the world, and that would have triggered the nuclear war between these two massive giants. So, what happened? The intense negotiation began between the Soviet Union and the United States at that time. The president of the United States of that time was John F. Kennedy, and Nikita Khrushchev started building the relationship, and they started understanding that if the nuclear war would have happened, then no one will going to survive. As a result of that, both of them took the backstage. And the Soviet Union, after the end of the October 1962 Cuban missile, the Soviet Union started building the nuclear weapon at the much faster rate. In 1970s, both US and the USSR reached equal number of warheads, nuclear warheads, which pushed both of them for the first strategic arms control negotiations. We will going to talk about the SALT Treaty after that, after some times. Now we have to talk about the space race and the arms race, because this was the part of the Cold War, and space race is very vital. That led to the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union, and arms race also pushed Soviet Union to the brink of the bankruptcy, and that forced Soviet Union to get disintegrated in 1991. What had happened in the space race? Soviet Union was the first country in the world who sent human beings. First they sent Laika, the dogs, into the space. Then they sent the human beings into the space. Yuri Gagarin, Valentina Tereshkova, all of them were in the space. They were the first human beings in the space. And they sent their Sputnik. Sputnik was the first satellites into the space. And the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on October 4. And that was the first Soviet satellites. United States were far behind. That put United States in a very tight place, and the United States started building their space program, and the Soviet government and the United States government started investing the huge amounts of money in the space race. As a result of that, United States became the first country in the world to send human beings on the surface of the moon. 21st July 1969, with the help of the Apollo 11 mission, the first human being land on the moons. So that was an historic time for the world. That was the historic time for everyone in the world, because there was no one from the world ever landed on the moon. That was the space race. Arms race, I have already I mean, I am already discussing this arms race and it will continue. So space race pushed the Soviet Union to the brinks of the bankruptcy. And Soviet Union started spending the huge amounts of money in the space research that was not necessary for that time, but they wanted to prove their point to the United States that they were far more efficient than the United States. That pushed them into the brink of the bankruptcy. Their economy was in dwindle. The countries, those who were the part of the Soviet Union, they started separating in 1991. There was another reason. There were several other reasons. Not solely the space race is responsible. Other reasons are also there. We will going to talk about it. Now, the problem within. The Soviet Union was not a democratic country. It was an authoritarian country. And it was ruled by the so many premier, those who were the part of the communist regime or the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at that time. Their first leader was Vladimir Lenin. The Vladimir Lenin came to the power or established the communist regime in the Soviet Union in and around First World War in 1990s, and that was the Bolshevik movement that was run or led by the Vladimir Lenin, and he became the first leader of the Soviet Union. After Vladimir Lenin, Stalin became the leader. After Stalin, it was Nikita Khrushchev. After Nikita Khrushchev, it was Leonid Brezhnev. After Leonid Brezhnev, it was Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev was the last premier or president of the Soviet Union. Because after Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet Union became disintegrated, or when the Mikhail Gorbachev was in power, Soviet Union started disintegrated and already disintegrated when Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia. Because when Soviet Union became disintegrated, Russia became the independent country and its first president was Boris Yeltsin. After Boris Yeltsin, it was the Vladimir Putin who is still today running the country. As a result of the communist regime, the country was a very, very corrupt nation. All of its bureaucracy was a vermin for the country that was eating the countries within. They were rich, they had huge amounts of money, but all the peoples, those who were living in the Soviet Union, by doing the agricultural things or doing the jobs into the military industrial complex or other civilian complexes or the power plants, they were all poor because the wages were not there. The wages were very low. As a result of that, there was some corruptions, there was competition between the soldiers. Because why the competition between the soldiers were there? Because if the soldiers will going to able to came up with a new ideas to counter the United States with a better plan, then states will going to give them more amount of money. When the states will going to give them more amount of money, then more amount of cut they will going to get from that funding. As a result of that, there was a competition between the leaders or military leaders of the Soviet Union, and one of that I will going to tell you right now is the competition between the two generals. One was Mikhail Yaghnel and the second one was the Vladimir Chelony. So these two leaders were fighting over the issue of the two missile system. One was SS-11 and the another was SS-18. Mikhail Yaghnel was interested of improvement of SS-11 and Vladimir Chelony was interested of developing the new ICBM system that was SS-18. The United States came up with the first ICBM or the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, which was R7 on August 16, 1957. That is a very important data. You should need to remember that. those who are in the colleges, those who are preparing for the examination, they need this kind of data. So to resolve the issues between these two generals, the Mikhail Yagnel and the Vladimir Chelony, another one was appointed. Another president of the Academy of Science was appointed by Brezhnev, and whose name was Mstislav Kledesh. Mstislav Kledesh was appointed to resolve the issues between these two leaders. But Mstislav Kledesh also failed to resolve the issues between these two leaders, and the Soviet Union has to come up, or has to give the equal amounts of money, or has to assure the equal amount of money in 3 separate missile program, which simply means that the more weapons with the help, more money, and that would eventually bankrupt the Soviet Union. So you can clearly understand that why Soviet Union was disintegrated. There was not only one mistake they made. They made a mistake in space race. They made a mistakes in missile technology improvement system. They were fighting against each other, but they were making the very good quantity and the very good quality of weapons. As a result, as they were working very diligently in improving their weapon system, at the beginning of the 1970s, the US and the USSR both developed the MIRV technologies. But MIRV technologies that the United States developed, which has the capability, they started installing the MIRV technique in Minuteman III missile system that could carry up to 3 warheads. But the Soviet Union technology that was improved or upgraded in SS-18 missiles, that was capable of carrying 7 to 8 warheads. You can clearly see the differences between the warheads. That means if Soviet Union wanted to target 7 to 8 places, it could be able to target the 7 to 8 cities of the United States. But if United States needed to attack or needed to target 7 to 8, they could not be. They have to launch 2 missiles. So they have to spend more amount of money. You can clearly see that. But Soviet Union failed because of their own mistake. Now there was a tense moment. We all knew that 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis almost gave us the heart attack, almost gave the world the heart attack. The world was on the verge of the nuclear war, and Nixon took the stock of the situation when the nuclear race came to its peak. The Nixon took the stock of the situations, and he was not happy with those developments. As described by the NSA and the later Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is one of the most important political figure in the history of the United States. He got the Nobel Peace Prize for fomenting the war. I'm making fun of the Nobel Peace Prize over here because the Nobel Peace Prize should not be given to the Henry Kissingers. The Henry Kissinger was responsible for several wars that was fomented at that time. So I can say it was one of the mistakes that the Nobel Committee has made. But what you can say, you can come to a conclusion that the Nobel Prize was also influenced by the some of the groups or the some of the leaders at that time that forced them to give the Nobel Peace Prize to Henry Kissinger. Anyway, the Soviet was also in a very tense mode because they also came up with the US nuclear attack study, and they found out that the US attack first when the United States attacked the Soviet Union, then the million citizens were found dead. The military has been reduced 1/1000 of the strength. That means almost all the military personnel of the Soviet Union were destroyed if United States decided to use the nuclear arsenal against the Soviet Union, and 85% of the Soviet industry would have been in ruins. So President Brezhnev and the President Alexei Kosygin were in the same shock as was the President Nixon. You have to remember the name of the Alexei Kosygin. That name I will going to repeat again. So none of these countries were not interested to engage into war, but they engaged into war because they engaged into a cold war because they needed to earn the money. We can say the economy, the more bigger enemy, that means more bigger nuclear arsenal, more bigger productions of the military goods, and more amount of money needed to be invested in the military industrial complex. Both of them had the same mentality, both of them were in the same state of mind. As a result of that, we saw the Cold World War, and none of them have tried to solve that war by seeing or by sitting somewhere, by talking to each others. Now we will going to talk about the SALT I. What was the SALT I? SALT was the Strategic Arms Limitations Act, which was signed between President Nixon and the Brezhnev in 1969. As I say, that President Nixon and the President Brezhnev both were very much unhappy because of the nuclear development, nuclear deterrence development, or the nuclear arsenal development. Both of them found out that if they attack each other, there will be no United States or the Soviet Union. There will be only the land without the populations will be left over. So they knew that. So that is why they came up with the solutions that both of them will going to reduce the number of strategic weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, and the SALT II. SALT II also signed in the 1979 under the President Carter, between the President Carter, and at that time in 1974 it was the time of the same persons. 1974 was the Leonid Brezhnev. The Brezhnev was the same premier who signed the SALT II treaty, but it was never ratified by the United States because of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Now the Gulf of Tonkin. I already talked about the Gulf of Tonkin. It was an event that was happened because of the suspicious attack by the northern Vietnamese rebels or the army on a US naval ship, and as a result of that, United States started sending more troops in Vietnam, and the war began very big. The United States started using napalm bomb. As a result of that, the world saw the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre, one of the most august massacre that the world have ever witnessed. And United States also bombed Laos and Cambodia. Laos and Cambodia was not part of this war, but United States attacked them because the northern Vietnamese soldiers were using these two countries to invade the southern Vietnam. Now the Soviet dead hand. What was the Soviet dead hand? The Soviet dead hand was developed in 1982. It was the combined strategic nuclear arsenals of the superpowers held the explosive powers approximately 1 million Hiroshima bomb. So by the 1982, both of them had huge amounts of nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union was too scared because they invaded Afghanistan. They became very suspicious of the Soviet Union's United States acts of doing things against the Soviet Union. As a result of that, Soviet Union, even with the huge amounts of nuclear warhead, was the fearful, and as a result of that, they envisioned a fully automatic system known as a dead hand, in which the computer alone would issue the order to launch. That was the plan. But dead hand was not that much of effective. Later, I will going to talk about an event. That event would have started another nuclear war after 1962, but it did not start because of the very good decisions by a Soviet general who saved world from the nuclear war. That man is Stanislav Petrov. Let me tell you who is Stanislav Petrov. Stanislav Petrov is he is not alive right now. He died in 1977. And Stanislav Petrov was the man who saved the world from the nuclear war. And what was the war? As the lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Petrov was in the duty on September 26, 1983. And in the 1983, what happened? The United States and the NATO were testing their weapons, were engaged in the different kinds of activities in and around the Soviet Union. And the early warning satellite systems, or you can say the dead hand, has monitored the detection of the 5 US arsenal, 5 US nuclear armed intercontinental ballistic missiles towards the Soviet Union. The Petrov was faced with the critical choice that had to be made immediately. Thread the warning as the false alarm or the alert his superiors would likely launch a counterattack. So that was the end of the world. So what the Petrov did not pass the order or pass the alarm to its superiors. Petrov decided to look after the signals, and when he started observing the signal, he indicated or he noticed that signals immediately died down, or after some time it died down, and he started speculating that if United States wanted to attack the Soviet Union, then they would not have launched only the 5 nuclear warhead. The United States would have launched 1,000 nuclear warhead. So as a result of that, the war between the Soviet Union and the United States were not happened. That actually not happened. As a result of that things were going on at that time. So what the US planned, US was very suspicious of the Soviet Union too. So United States started developing their own technique of detecting the nuclear missile systems from the Soviet Union. So United States technique to detect the nuclear missile launched from anywhere of the world was called the Defense Support Program. That program was under the Space Force. Space Force was the part of the US Armed Forces, and the US has several layers of the satellite detection system that would pick heat and the blast signature. Let me make you understand how this system work, because this system still exists. Suppose Soviet Union would have launched any missiles from its land. So United States have its nuclear detection satellites over the Soviet Union, because these satellites were geosynchronous satellites. United States already placed their geosynchronous satellites over the Soviet Union. If Soviet Union fired any missile, then these missiles would have picked the signals, would have picked the heat and the blast signatures. After picking the blast signature, the satellites would have sent the signals to its receiving station, the signal receiving station in the United States or in their ally country in Japan or South Korea. As a result of that, United States would have launched their missile defense systems, would have launched the missiles from their missile defense systems and destroyed that nuclear weapons into the mid-air. That was the plan, and that is the plan even today. I hope you understand that what I have tried to make you understand. And this is the same system that works in today's time for every nation. Every nation is trying to develop these kinds of systems, but very limited amount of nations do have this kind of system. According to my research, the United States and the Soviet Union have this kind of system. China also have this kind of system, and India has bought S-400 missile defense systems, which is based on this. S-400 missile defense system can block the nuclear missile defense from any level, from any countries. That is why India bought the S-400 missile defense systems. But I do not think India do have the satellites that can detect the infrared signals the infrared signals from any of the nuclear missiles or any nuclear missile launched from any nations? I do not think so. India or any other countries, not even the China, do have these kind of systems. Because these kind of systems are very expensive and need huge amounts of money for the maintenance. First DSP system was launched in the early 1970s. The original DSP satellites weighed 2000 pounds and had 400 watts of power and 2000 detectors, and was designed life, and its design life was only 1.25 years. You can clearly understand that a satellite of $1 million cost is in the sky, living there only 1.25 years. And after 1.25 years, the United States have to replenish that place with the help of the new systems. See, this system is very expensive, and the countries only like the United States can afford this kind of system. Since then, since 1970s, it has went through several upgradations and the numerous improvements to enhance its reliability and the capacity. That was required because 1.25 is a very low number. United States needed to increase that 1.25. As a result of that, United States now, these satellites weigh 5,250 pounds, and it has the capacity of generating the power 1,516 watts, and its detectors or sensors has increased from 2,000 to 6,000. So it is now generating more power. As a result of that, it can produce that more power to more sensors. That is why the more sensors are there. And its life cycle has increased from 1.25 years to 5 years. So that is an excellent system that every country, those who are having the nuclear power, should have, because we are not far away from the nuclear Armageddon. But these systems are really, really expensive. Space Delta 4 controlling these satellites, its headquarters is in Colorado, is in Berkeley Air Force Base. All these satellites are in geosynchronous orbit, I already told you, and this whole system known as the space-based infrared system. So it receives the infrared signals. It receives the infrared signals from the nuclear warheads, which has been thrown by the other countries. So it is a very expensive system. You have to admit that. And the General Curtis E. LeMay. This name you have to remember, because this is the man who was the first commander of the Strategic Air Command, and the creator and the father of the US Strategic Nuclear Deterrence. And he worked with B-16. He worked with the B-16, the formations of the B-16, bombing, coordinating during the time of Cold War. He also operated B-47, B-52. He worked in those projects, B-47 project and B-52 project. And he also helped the group of companies or military industrial complex in development of fighters that were F-80, F-84 and F-86. So you can clearly understand the experience of that man and how good that man was. Now we have come to the end of this Cold War days. What had happened at the end of the Cold War days? Cold War actually ended during the time of the presidency of Ronald Reagan as well as the George H.W. Bush. The Ronald Reagan was personally very critical of using the nuclear warheads against the Soviet Union, and he dreamed of abolishing these nuclear weapons. He was so worried about the use of the nuclear weapons, and the nuclear explosion led to the end of the earth, and expressed belief in the biblical story of Armageddon. Armageddon is a story from the religious books, and he also wrote in his diary about it, and in his own words, and he says, "I swear I believe Armageddon is near." He wrote that because Israel bombed an Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1989. But the George H.W. Bush was very much responsible of maintaining the order of the nuclear or nuclear bombs order at that time. He was very much different of the Ronald Reagan. George W. Bush was a man belongs to the MIC lobby group, that military industrial complex lobby group. He was the former intelligence or the head of the intelligence of Central Intelligence Agency, and he knew the US cannot survive without the war, and he also knew that for the survival of the United States, Soviet Union was necessary evil. So he knew that. And in 1953, the President Dwight E. Eisenhower, in his United Nations address in 1953, called for the atom of peace. When the whole world was looking for the development of the nuclear weapon after the American Manhattan Project, which helped the US to develop the nuclear weapons, the Dwight E. Eisenhower, the president, was lecturing the world on the atom of peace. It was a simple hypocrisy. The United States has, and at that time the Soviet Union has something in their behavior that after doing something wrong, both of them came up with lectures that we have to maintain the peace, we have to maintain the peaceful environment, we have to maintain the human stability. These kinds of nonsense logic they always came up with. And Dwight D. Eisenhower also came up with that same logic. As I said, that the George H.W. Bush was one of the main man or the main head behind the nuclear arsenals of the United States during the time of the Cold World War. He was always part of the group of the MIC, lobbying group of the MIC, and he was also involved in doing so many vicious work during his CIA days and also during the days of his vice presidency, and he also became the president of the United States for 4 years. So his days, United States saw several ups and downs. One of the ups and downs the country or the United States or the world saw in 1971 Iranian revolutions, which removed the Reza Shah Pahlavi. Reza Shah Pahlavi was a titular king of the Iran, and the revolution kept American embassy staffs as hostage. The Jimmy Carter was then the president. So Jimmy Carter's popularity came to its nadir, and as a result of several kinds of war, engaged in several war, Vietnam War, then the war in the several parts of Eastern Europe, the US economy was taking the burden of these wars because United States needed to invest in these wars with the help of the taxation money of US populations. So populations of the United States was actually funding that war. When the war broke out, in every nation this is the same story. The people of any country invest in the war. As a result of the huge investment of the United States in that war, in different war, the United States, the inflation within the United States was too high, and also there was a scarcity of energy because in 1960s and the 1970s the constant war between the Middle Eastern countries and the Israel was going on, and oil embargo was happening at that time, and that was very much frequent. The Soviet Union declared oil embargo against Israel and the Western countries. They stopped sending oil to those countries, those who were involved or the ally of Israel. So oil embargo was very much prevalent in those days. As a result of that, all the countries in the world were facing the energy crisis. As a result of that, Ronald Reagan became the president of the United States. Ronald Reagan also fought against Jimmy Carter in 1976, but he lost. But he became president in 1981. In 1981, he came up with single majority, and he became the president of the United States with very steady hand. And he started influencing Soviet Union. He started influencing the leaders of the Soviet Union. As a result of that, the leader of that time, the Mikhail Gorbachev, was influenced. he came up with the two policies, those who became the suicidal for the Soviet Union. He came up with the two policies. One was glasnost, that is called the openness, and the another one was perestroika. Glasnost means the Soviet Union started giving right to the Baltic nation state, that means Lithuania, Latvia, then the Poland and the other states in the Eastern European countries, then the Ukraine. These are the countries were getting more and the more rights, more and the more power out of the Soviet clutches. And after that, the perestroika means he started restructuring his own party, the Communist Party. When he started pushing that logic or started pushing his ideas of improving their own party, improving his own party started crumble, because all of the leaders, those who were at the top of that party, all were very much corrupt. They were very much reluctant to leave their post. As a result of that, they were pushing for the non-reform. But Mikhail Gorbachev pushing for the reforms into the society, into the countries. And as a result of the openness or the glasnost, the human rights and the cultural affairs, these kinds of logic started brewing in the Eastern Asian countries, and they started showing, these countries started observing or started witnessing different kinds of protest or the movement. As a result of that, the countries in the Eastern Europe, that Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, these are the Belarus, these are the countries started getting independence, and they got independence in 1991. Not only these countries, the Caucasus region countries. What were the Caucasus region countries? That they were the Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia. These three countries got independence from Soviet Union. And the Central Asian countries, that is Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. These are the countries. All of them gets independence from the Soviet Union. But most of the countries, those who got independence from the Soviet Union, has came under the influence of the democratic governance. Most of the countries, those who are in the Eastern Asia and the Caucasus region countries. But the countries, those who are in the Central Asia, they started following the same rule that was being followed by the Soviet Union since 1945 to 1991. They became dictators, and they are still dictatorial nations. There was no change. And this is the famous pictures. What was that pictures is indicating? It was the famous picture when Ronald Reagan went to Moscow. That was his first Moscow visit. Ronald Reagan and the Gorbachev finalized the interim and the immediate or intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, that is called the INF treaty. This treaty was signed between United States and Soviet Union after the Senate's notifications in May 1988 that forced these two countries to reduce the production of intermediate range of nuclear missiles. That is the photo. That was the famous photo that was captured at that time in 1988. And Mr. Gorbachev got the Nobel Peace Prize for disintegrating his own nations. You can see the things that I have already talked about the Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger got the Nobel Prize for what? For fomenting the war? Am I very much capable of asking these questions towards the Nobel Committee? Why the Gorbachev was given the Nobel Prize? For destroying his own country, destroying the concept of his own country? Yes, Soviet Union has different kinds of mistakes, made different kinds of mistakes, and the Soviet Union was not a perfect nation. No nation is a perfect nation. It was a nation with very much flaws. But destroying his own nations cannot be given. A person who is responsible of disintegrating his own nations cannot be given the Nobel Peace Prize. But he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, let's move on. That enemy within. Why enemy within? USSR or Soviet Union was a very corrupt nation. as there was a very much corruptions, that is why the leaders or the people, those who are working in the government agencies and the government companies, they were all corrupt, because they were getting in those companies in the intentions of making the money. How they were making the money? They were making the money by taking the money from other states or by selling the goods to the other countries. And in 1979 we saw that. In 1979, what United States did, United States bought Russian weapons from Belarus, Russian weapons from Poland, Russian weapons from Egypt, and several Russian stocks from China. And United States also bought Russian weapons from the soldiers, those who were fighting against Mujahideens at that time in Afghanistan. Because of the corruptions, they were able to bought those weapon systems from their own soldiers. So they were very much corrupt. And this person, the Vladimir Vetrov was the person who defected. Obviously he defected because of getting independence of a country that was authoritarian. His mind was, maybe he defected because of the money, because at that time, during the time of Cold War, the defection people, the peoples used to get the higher post in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and also France, Germany, Western Germany. If he defected, as if he defected from the Soviet Union, he obviously got some help, got some post, got some money from France, because he defected to France. And after that, the reports he stole from his own organizations, the KGB, that was leaked to the United States and France and all the countries of the Western bloc. What he did, he was an engineer. He was an engineer in the KGB whose job was to evaluate the intelligence collected by the KGB's Western technologies collection systems, because that group was responsible for spying on the new Western technologies, new Western companies, those who were developing the new Western technologies, and steal their blueprints. Because United States at that time do have the very good technology. Even today they have the world class technology that no one has. As a result, Soviet Union at that time wanted to steal the technology, particularly those who are related to the oil productions. As there was sanctions on the Soviet Union, they were not capable of buying the systems or the softwares or the valves or the equipments, those who were required to improve the flow of the oil from Soviet Union to European nations. As a result of that, he started spying, the KGB started spying for those goods, for those softwares. And USSR bought the software from Canada at that time, the oil distribution software. And that oil distribution software was sabotaged by the CIA. And what CIA did? CIA orchestrated a blast, and that was seen from a million miles away. That blast created the fireball that was seen from the millions miles away. That was the plan. And that man, this Vladimir Vetrov, betrayed his own nations. And the Vetrov has secretly photographed 4,000 KGB documents on the program and stole them for the West. He also exposes the name of 200 people, those who were working in the US companies and the other Western companies and the other Western countries, laboratories, factories, government agencies. They were all, their position was compromised. All the peoples, those who were working for the Soviet Union, their position were compromised because of this man, the Vladimir Vetrov. All of those documents were passed to the George H.W. Bush, then to the CIA in August 1980s. So you can clearly see that how the things were happening at that time. And George H.W. Bush, let me tell you some of the stories of the George H.W. Bush. How good or how bad was the George H.W. Bush? George H.W. Bush was mastermind behind the Iran-Contra deal. and how he conducted that deal, because to operate the deal they needed the money. They had the money, but how they laundered that money? They laundered the money with the help of the Bank of Credit and the Commerce. That was the new bank, the BCCI bank. This acronym was BCCI bank, that was founded by a Pakistani, and the name of the Pakistani was Aga Hassan Abedi. This bank was used by George H.W. Bush and the several other gangs, those who were laundering the money, laundering the drugs money at that time. They used that bank, and that bank ceased to exist in 1991. And once in the 1980s, these banks came to the one of the most famous magazine of that time, that the one of the largest or the most influential bank of that time. So you can clearly understand that how the Pakistanis were being used by the United States peoples or the United States leader to launder their money. And at the end of the day, George H.W. Bush was never convicted, and Aga Hassan Abedi was convicted, and he died in Pakistan without getting any treatment, because he had the heart problem. Initially he got his treatment from the United States or United Kingdom with the help of the leadership. But when the need of the Aga Hassan Abedi completed or ended to the peoples of the United States, leadership of the United States, then he was thrown away. You can clearly see that is very important over here, that how United States use the peoples of the Pakistan during the time of 1971, and all the times when the laundering of money was needed. And this organization, this BCCI bank, was also responsible for laundering the money for the ISI. ISI is the espionage agency of Pakistan, and that agency was responsible for the development and the stealing of nuclear goods or the nuclear technology from different countries, of different Western countries, from Canada, from Netherlands, from Denmark. The nuclear technology was stolen by Pakistanis with the help of this bank by laundering the money. Now, so therefore we can come to a conclusion that Pakistan was a married wife of the United States. United States usually use Pakistan even today to influence the South Asian region, also the Central Asian region, also the Western Asian region. How do they influence that? United States have their interest in Pakistan, and the United States given billions of dollars from 1960 to 2002. I have only the data from 1960 to 2002, that $73.14 billion was given to Pakistan. You can clearly see that how much money was given. That is a massive amount of money that was given to Pakistan. Why? Because Pakistan was helping United States in doing or lobbying their interest in the South Asian region, Central Asian region, and in China. Because Pakistan was the mastermind in mending the relationship between the United States and China. In 1972, Nixon first visited China with the help of Pakistan. How they build up that relationship? They first send Henry Kissinger with the help of the Pakistani Air Force, Pakistani Airlines planes, because there was a very deep or operations that was not in front of the world. Henry Kissinger first visited China, or met Mao Zedong. After he visited Mao Zedong, then he fixed the meeting between the dictator Mao Zedong and President Nixon. And President Nixon also sent help for Pakistan in 1971 when Pakistan was raping Bengali women, when Pakistan was killing the Bengali babies in Bangladesh. Then Nixon sent their 7th Pacific Fleet only to help Pakistan. So you can clearly see that how United States gave them money. In 1979, when Pakistan was needed, because Pakistan was the neighbor of Afghanistan, USSR or Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, so to influence USSR in Afghanistan, they used Pakistan as a proxy to fight against the Soviet Union. During that time, uncountable amount of money, uncountable amount of weapons were given to Pakistan. Pakistan was the behind for the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Pakistan is still today, was and still today behind the creations of the different drug route from Asia to Europe to the United States. Still today, they are helping Pakistan. Donald Lu is the man of the State Department. He is influencing their leadership to give more and more money to Pakistan. They have already given $7 billion from IMF to Pakistan. And Pakistan is again asking for $15 billion. As a result of that, Donald Lu came up with solutions for immediate solution and agreed and pleaded to the US Senate to give Pakistan $100 million for immediate relief. And Pakistan was the ally of the United States. As a result, he became the member of SEATO and CENTO. That was the two group, NATO-like group of Asia. These two NATO-like group was led by the United States, and United States, with the help of these two groups, influenced the Central Asian region, South Asian region, China, and the Western Asian region. You will never going to find United States, existence of the United States and their forces in Africa at a very greater level, but you will going to find the presence of the US bases in Africa and all over Pacific, because there is a oil. There is a huge amounts of oil in Central Asia, also is in Western Asia or Middle East. They have bases in Saudi Arabia, they have base in Qatar, they have base in Kuwait, they have also base in Syria and Iraq, where they should not have the base. But they are there forcefully only to get the oil and get the gas, natural gas. That was the plan. That is the plan of the United States, to stay anywhere for oil, for gas, and to make their economy greater and the greater again. Now we need to discuss that what had happened after the end of the Cold War. Cold War end in 1991. What had happened immediately after the end of the Cold War? That war on terrorism began. The world started witnessing the terrorist attack in US installations. In US installations around the world. Some of you know about the Al-Qaeda's bomb blast in US embassies in Kenya and one of the another nations in Africa. It is a neighboring nations of Kenya. So in these two nations, the Al-Qaeda bombed the US embassies. And how many US people died? I think in the first country, the Kenya, 6 Americans died. In the second country, none. How the United States or Al-Qaeda came to know? In this case, the Al-Qaeda came to know that United States populations or the United States peoples or the ambassadors will not be there when they will going to bombed. Not in 1996, the World Trade Center first bombing happened. But where was the Osama bin Laden, the head of the Al-Qaeda? The head of the Al-Qaeda was in Dubai getting treatment for his kidney ailment. And who went there to meet them? The CIA head, the regional head of the CIA went to him and met him. And what had happened in Afghanistan after 2001? 2001, United States invaded Afghanistan. What had happened after that? After that, there was an invasion of Iraq in the name of WMD. There was no WMD, weapon of mass destruction. There is a general from the United States Army named is Wesley Clark. He exposes the US plan to invade 7 Muslim nations. United States at that time in and around 2001 to 2005 were getting prepared of invading Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Iran, Somalia, Sudan and Iraq. Except Iran, all other nations are the failed state in today's time. What had happened? Syria and Iraq devastated because of the ISIS. Who created ISIS? Some people say the ISIS created by the CIA and Mossad, because the leader of ISIS cannot be dead for 8 times. 8 times he died, 8 or 7 times. So this war on terrorism was a bogus thing that was created. If I go by the logic that all these terrorist attacks orchestrated by the United States, according to the conspiracy theories, because according to the conspiracy theories, 9/11 was a false. It was an attack that was orchestrated by the United States itself. I do not know. There were so many conspiracy theorists. They came up with their proof. They came up with several video photograph, several other things that was there. And they also came up with that the protections or the cyber protections and every kind of protection what was given to the World Trade Center, that was given by the organizations headed by some of the family persons of the George H.W. Bush. And that was a Kuwait-based company. As a result of that, there were so many people came up with and so many theories. I do not know. I do not have any idea what happened. But the war on terrorism began after the end of the Cold War. That was the war. That was the planned. Looks like it was planned, because Osama bin Laden was fighting in the favor of the United States in 1979 against the Soviet Union. He was the asset of the United States. And there was a words, I cannot recall the words of the man who said that one of the biggest asset of the United States turned against the United States. Whom he was indicating? He was indicating the Osama bin Laden. Anyway, right now we will going to talk about the similar events. That what are the events? It looks like the events of the Cold War, because something is not normal. The events those who are happening, it's not normal. After the end of the Cold War, the war on terrorism began, but the United States needed the bigger enemy. United States did not have a solid enemy. As a result of that, in 2008, in Bucharest NATO conference, United States came up with the proposals of making Ukraine and Georgia as the part of the NATO. What will happen if these two countries would become the part of NATO? Then United States would have been able to place their nuclear weapons, their arsenal, their persons at the border of Russia. That is a national security threat for Russia. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, captured South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the two oil-rich region that almost destroyed Georgia. Georgian economy now in shambles. Who was responsible for those colored revolution, the rose revolutions, the Jasmine revolutions? These are the revolutions. These are the revolutions created by the CIA. And Euromaidan revolution, that was the mind in Victoria Newland. You go over there. I mean, you go to the internet and find the woman named Victoria Newland. You will going to find that what she did during the time of Euromaidan protest. During the time of Euromaidan protest, he started helping the peoples, those who were involved in the Euromaidan protest. He started distributing several kinds of goods during the time of that protest. That was a visual proof. Because in today's time, we know that the cameras are everywhere, social medias are everywhere, the proofs are there, the solid proofs are there how Victoria Newland helped Ukraine to foment that riot. And after that riot, what happened? Russia captured some of the regions of Ukraine. That includes Crimea. The Crimea is one of the best strategically placed positions of Ukraine that would give the United States the upper hand over Russia, even after not putting Ukraine in their blocks, because United States influence in Ukraine was already at its peak. But they did not needed to create such kinds of protest, but they created such kind of protest to capture the country wholly, as they did in case of other countries. In case of Poland they did that, in case of Hungary they did that, in case of Germany they did that. And 1989 fall of German wall, we also know that what had happened after that. So these are the things. We are also observing the events of wars in Middle East. We are observing that the Israel started bombing Gaza. They have flattened the Gaza. They have bombed Gaza with 30 to 40,000 bombs. They are also bombing the some areas of Yemen, because of the Houthi rebels have started sending drones to the Ukraine to the Israeli cities like Tel Aviv. So as a result of that, the similar events are happening. Recently Lebanon bombed one of the northern cities in the Golan Heights, and that killed 12 children. And as a result, Israel bombed some of the southern parts. Therefore, I am saying that the similar events are happening, and we are still living in the Cold War days. So this is the end of the topic, guys. Thank you very much. If you have any question regarding this topic or any other topic, please approach me. Please ask me questions. I will give you the answers of these questions. Thank you again. See you.